Dawn hadn't even broken yet when her voice sliced through the construction site like shattered glass. She was a woman in an immaculate white hard hat, the kind of pristine white that had no business existing in a world of churned dirt and wet concrete. She was shoving a tablet into a man's face like the device itself was a death sentence. The man wore mud-caked boots up to his ankles, holding a notebook, an old, beat-up leather thing with crumpled pages holding years of handwritten notes, tiny script, and sketches that looked like maps of a territory no software had ever mapped out. She ripped the pages he had just laid on the table, tore them right out. She tossed the scraps into the air like trash, letting the paper drift down slowly, dancing in the bitter pre-dawn wind, while she pointed a manicured finger. Her voice spiked, loud enough to make sure not just him but every single guy on the crew heard it. "You and your backwoods scribbles. This is a $50 million project, not some dirt road farm. The software is flawless. You're fired. Security will escort you off my site." The man didn't answer. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even try to defend himself. He slowly bent down, his knees protesting silently under the weight of decades of backbreaking labor, and started picking up the torn pieces of his notebook from the dirt, one by one. His calloused hands were shaking slightly, not out of fear, but that raw, physical tremor that hits when your body absorbs a shock your mind is still trying to process. When he stood back up, he took one last look at the massive crater carved into the earth below, at the concrete being poured into the forms, at the foundation of a $50 million high-rise that would take years to build. And he muttered quietly to himself, with the heavy voice of a man stating a deadly fact nobody wants to hear. The water vein. It runs deeper than they think. Then he walked away, shoving the torn scraps into his pocket, while she had already turned her back on him. Her eyes were glued back to the perfect glowing screen of her tablet, wearing the smug smirk of someone who thought they had just swatted a minor pest. But to really grasp what pushed these two to this breaking point at the crack of dawn, we need to rewind. We need to go back to where all true stories start, in the pitch black before the sun comes up, in the places where absolutely nobody is watching. At 4 a.m., the prefabricated trailer where Tommy Sullivan slept looked exactly like the dozens of other rusted-out boxes he'd lived in over 32 years on construction sites. Paper-thin walls, a concrete floor covered by a threadbare rug, a tiny window looking out over the pitch-black, undeveloped lot. It was the kind of place people call temporary so often that it just becomes a permanent way of life. But there was a specific order in that cramped space that didn't belong to a man who had given up. It was the fierce discipline of a guy who learned how to make a lot out of nothing. The flashlight hanging on its exact hook above the cot, the toolbox lined up under the table with military precision, and sitting dead center on that table, the battered leather notebook that was last brand new when his little girl was still in high school. Tommy pulled a pocket knife from his jeans and sharpened his pencil with the quiet patience of a sacred ritual. Every movement was deliberate, the angle of the blade, the pressure applied, the lead calibrated to the exact razor-thin thickness he knew worked best for his intricate soil diagrams. When he finished, he flipped the notebook open to the bookmarked page and stared down at the sketch he'd drawn the night before. It was a map. Not the kind of sterile grid that pops up on geographic information systems or high-priced geotechnical consulting reports. This was a different breed of map, the kind that can only be drawn by a man who has spent 3 decades walking on the exact same dirt across different states, learning how to read what the earth is trying to say. There were hand-drawn contour lines, depth markers jotted down with brutal accuracy, right next to margin notes written in plain English, heavily peppered with old-school blue-collar slang, and the kind of country boy phrases his grandfather used to describe the land when he was just a kid. Tucked into the top left corner of the notebook, wedged between the leather cover and the first page, was a photograph. A young woman in a graduation gown, grinning at the camera with the fierce intensity of someone who fought tooth and nail for every inch of ground she gained. Tommy had that exact same jawline, that same stubborn way of holding his chin just a fraction of an inch higher than everyone else. He had slipped that photo in there 4 years ago, right on her graduation day, and hadn't moved it since. He snapped the notebook shut, downed the black coffee he'd boiled on a cheap hot plate, and stepped out into the dark blue chill of the site with the leather book tucked securely under his arm. Across town, on a high floor of a glass facade corporate high-rise reflecting the waking skyline, Dr. Alara Vance was standing in front of a massive projection wall that spanned the entire length of the boardroom. The image was undeniably impressive, a fully rendered 3D model, color-coded to isolate every single soil layer, every pressure variable, every structural stress point projected for the next 50 years. It was the absolute pinnacle of a $1 million software suite that took 8 grueling months to custom calibrate just for this site. She pitched it to the board of investors with the slick fluency of an apex predator who completely owns the room. Ilara Vance was 42, armed with a PhD in geotechnical engineering from an elite Ivy League program. And she had built her entire ruthless reputation on the rock-solid premise that technology had rendered blue-collar field experience completely obsolete. It wasn't just a sales tactic she used for boardrooms. It was a deeply ingrained religion, cemented over years of watching old-school projects built on gut feelings get bulldozed and replaced by modern steel calculated with godlike computational precision. Our simulation factors in every single geological variable logged in the national database, she told the board, tapping a laser pointer against the digital foundation cross-section. There is zero margin for subjective human interpretation. The numbers are the numbers. She let the heavy silence hang in the air to let that sink in. We hire hands and muscle to execute the labor. The brain of this entire operation is sitting right here on this screen. One of the heavy-hitter investors chimed in, asking about the local crew, wondering if there was any regional boots-on-the-ground knowledge that might flag something the system missed. Ilara flashed that perfectly calibrated, razor-thin smile of someone who has heard the question 1,000 times and has the bulletproof answer locked and loaded. With all due respect to local tradition, we are not anchoring a $50 million skyscraper on backwoods geological folklore. This software was engineered by the top data scientists in the country. That is the ironclad guarantee I am offering you. The board nodded in unison. The meeting adjourned, and Ilara Vance turned back to her glowing screen, high on the deep, intoxicating satisfaction of someone who genuinely, totally believes they are bulletproof. She wasn't some comic book villain getting off on being evil. She was something infinitely more dangerous, a fiercely intelligent person who had violently confused technical competence with absolute, unquestionable wisdom. She had reached a point where her own massive ego acted like a brick wall, blocking out any vital information if it didn't come wrapped in the right Ivy League packaging. It was in this exact toxic environment that Tommy Sullivan first approached her out in the mud. It was week 3 of the massive excavation. The heavy machinery had hit the system's target depth, and the foundation forms were actively being set when Tommy spotted something dead wrong in the soil profile the excavator had just ripped open. It was subtle, a slight color shift in the heavy clay, a weird bleeding moisture that had no business being there this time of year. A gritty texture he'd seen before on other doomed sites, and had learned to respect the hard way. He marched straight up to the temporary AC-chilled trailer, where Ilara was holding court, rapped his scarred knuckles on the door, pushed his way in when she didn't answer, but didn't tell him to screw off either, and walked right up to her desk with the notebook flipped open to the exact diagram he had painstakingly drawn the night before. With the blunt, rough-around-the-edges vocabulary of a guy who learned his trade in the dirt instead of a lecture hall, he laid out exactly what he was seeing. There was a rogue underground water vein slicing right through that specific grid of the lot. It wasn't dead static. It was a living thing that shifted with the seasons, swelled aggressively during the winter freezes, and ran at a tricky depth that the shiny official geological surveys completely missed, because those suits only took their core samples during the bone-dry summer. He pointed a calloused finger at the red zone on his sketch, then pointed out the trailer window straight at the corresponding kill zone down in the trench. Ilara didn't even glance at the notebook. She stared at her tablet, swiped through a couple of pristine screens. Then she looked up at him with that specific dead-eyed expression of a corporate elite being socially forced to humor the hired help. My simulation accounts for every single geological variable logged in the national database. It was the exact same corporate script she fed the board. She recited it with the same robotic arrogance. Do you happen to hold a PhD in geotechnical engineering? Tommy dropped his gaze. That wasn't a real question. It was an execution. It was the most ruthless, efficient way to tell him this conversation was dead on arrival. It was her telling him that his dirt-stained notebook had no place in her $1 million environment, and that his language, the language of a man who actually knew the earth because he'd been bleeding into it for 3 decades, was a language this project absolutely refused to translate. He snapped the notebook shut, tucked it under his arm, and walked right back out to his post without saying another damn word. But he didn't just forget what he saw. He couldn't. because there was a ticking time bomb buried in that soil profile that kept burning into the back of his eyelids every time he tried to sleep. It was raw data his gut had processed long before his brain could even put words to it. The kind of lethal, street-smart knowledge you don't get from a textbook, but from a lifetime of paying absolute attention to the physical world. He went back to the notebook. He went deeper into the diagram. He spent the next few days obsessively logging new observations, every single morning at 4 a.m., pencil sharpened to a lethal point, flashlight hanging over his head. And then he swallowed his pride and went back to Ilara Vance a second time. He brought more hard data, desperately trying to build a bridge between the disaster he knew was coming and the sterile corporate language she demanded to hear. It was that second desperate attempt that ended with his notebook torn to shreds dancing in the wind, with her screaming about $50 million and backwoods hillbillies and firing him on the spot, all while the rest of the crew played deaf because pretending to be invisible was the only armor they had left. It's sickening to think that someone could just violently trash decades of hard-earned experience with such toxic arrogance, isn't it? That a person could literally rip up another man's life's work and mock it as hillbilly scribbles when it's actually a masterclass built on blood and time, and do it right in front of the whole crew without batting an eye. If you feel that same anger burning in your chest right now, smash that like button. Show them you're riding with Tommy. Because Ilara Vance had made the fatal, catastrophic mistake that overly educated people make all the time. She mistook the map for the actual war zone. And the war zone, specifically that patch of dirt with the rogue water vein bleeding deeper than any shiny database ever recorded, didn't give a damn about the price tag on her software. It didn't care about her Ivy League PhD. It didn't care about the $50 million. Water always finds a way. It always does. And the moment it would finally break through was creeping closer, with the dead calm inevitability of a disaster that nobody wanted to listen to when there was still time to stop it. The suits from the board showed up on a heavy, overcast morning, wearing tailored suits and Italian leather shoes that had absolutely no business touching wet gravel. Dr. Ilara Vance paraded them around the perimeter with the smug ownership of an artist showing off her masterpiece, every hand gesture highlighting a massive milestone, every budget number flawlessly quoted from memory, every dramatic pause perfectly timed to let the sheer godlike scale of the project sink into the bones of the men writing the checks. The foundation was locking in. Massive concrete beams were ripping out of the earth, with the terrifying precision of a machine calculated down to the last variable. Ilara narrated every phase with the slick flow of someone who hadn't rehearsed out of insecurity, but out of pure ego. The rush of a zealot who truly believes in her own gospel and demands everyone else see exactly what she sees. That's exactly when the VIP tour rolled past the sector where Tommy was working. He was gripping a heavy spade, grinding out one of the brutal, back-breaking grunt jobs they had banished him to after their first clash. The kind of mindless labor designed to keep a man quiet, out of sight, and out of the way. He was working with his head slightly bowed, locked into the steady, mechanical rhythm of a man who learned how to inhabit the silence without getting lost inside it. Ilara Vance spotted him, and she made a choice. She could have just ignored him. She could have guided the billionaires right past him without making him a target. But there was something rotting inside her, maybe a desperate, toxic need to assert dominance in front of an important audience, to prove that her iron fist was the only reason this site was running flawlessly. It made her stop dead in her tracks, pivot slightly toward the group, and point right at him with the casual cruelty of a tourist pointing at a museum exhibit. This right here is the exact obsolete old-world mentality we aggressively purged from this project. She projected her voice loud enough to make damn sure he heard every single word, delivering it with the sociopathic ease of someone who doesn't even view the guy with the shovel as a person requiring basic respect. We rely on hard science now, not campfire folklore. One of the investors gave an awkward, vague smile, not knowing exactly where to look. Another just kept walking like he was suddenly deaf, which was honestly the most honest way to handle the radioactive awkwardness. Tommy didn't even flinch. His knuckles wrapped around the hickory handle turned bone white for a split second. That violent, involuntary physical tell when the body reacts before the brain can slam the emergency brakes. He finished his stroke, buried the steel blade into the dirt, scooped what he had to scoop, and kept his mouth shut. But something deep in his gut logged that exact moment with a totally different weight than all the other humiliations. Because those other hits had been private. Just him and her. No peanut gallery, no performing for an elite crowd who didn't have the context to question what they were hearing. This one was a public, deliberate execution, delivered with the terrifying lightness of a predator who doesn't even think they need to justify the kill. The next few days brought a slow, miserable, creeping drizzle. The kind of icy rain that doesn't stop the machines, but coats the entire site in a greasy, penetrating slickness that bleeds into the concrete forms and turns the trench into a treacherous death trap. Tommy kept doing the grunt work he was assigned, but his eyes never stopped scanning the pit with that hyper-vigilant radar you can't just turn off. The raw instinct of a guy who spent a lifetime reading what the dirt communicates and couldn't just stop reading it just because someone told him his brain had no value. It was on one of those miserable mornings that he spotted the fracture. It was a hairline crack, practically invisible, creeping up the massive excavation wall at the exact grid coordinate he had marked on his notebook sketch. A thin ribbon of muddy water was bleeding out of it, not some massive screaming geyser, but that slow, relentless creeping weep that trained rookies completely ignore, and battle-scarred veterans instantly recognize as the earth quietly opening a conversation with anyone willing to listen. Tommy flagged the foreman. The foreman, armed with the slippery caution of a guy who survives by aggressively passing the buck, immediately radioed Dr. Vance. She marched down into the mud with her tablet, and a look that perfectly blended extreme irritation with arrogant condescension. She visually scanned the crack for about 3 seconds, booted up the diagnostic suite on her device, ran a rapid scan, and then turned to the nervous engineers flanking her with the smug certainty of a priest who just checked in with a higher power. It's just residual surface runoff. The active drainage grid is operating at 98.4% efficiency. She killed the screen, tucked the tablet firmly under her arm, and then she locked eyes with Tommy, flashing that same toxic smirk she'd weaponized before. The smile that has nothing to do with joy and everything to do with establishing dominance. Maybe your ancient tribal wisdom can teach us how to mop it up with a dirty rag. The junior engineers actually laughed. Not all of them. 2 guys stared hard at the mud, fighting a visible losing battle with their own spines, choosing not to join in but completely lacking the guts to openly cross her. But the laughs were there, and they were loud enough to let Tommy know exactly where he stood. Tommy didn't laugh. He stared dead at the fracture one last time. He watched that lethal little ribbon of water bleeding out of the clay with the cold, unstoppable patience of a force of nature that exists independently of whether anyone believes in it. And then he went back to shoveling, carrying a heavy block of ice in his chest that had officially stopped being professional concern and violently mutated into a ticking emergency. He didn't sleep a single minute that night. He cracked the notebook open at 4 a.m. like always. But this time there was no Zen pencil sharpening ritual. He was sketching with the frantic speed of a man running out of time trying to communicate a disaster. A brutal cross-section of the trench, mapping the exact strata he'd visually confirmed, slashing the rogue water vein across the page in heavy red lead. And right on top of it, he drew the massive central foundation pillar, showing the exact kill zone where the two would violently collide if they kept pouring on schedule. It was a brilliant, crystal-clear schematic. It was hard, undeniable data. It was the exact kind of high-level threat assessment that, in any other context, coming from any other body, would have been taken straight to the chief engineer with deadly seriousness. But Tommy knew he didn't have another context, another language, or another body. He only had what he had, and he went for it anyway. He cornered Dr. Vance the next morning, right before the chaos of the heavy shift started, walking straight up to her with the book wide open to the fresh intel. This time he didn't stumble. He had rehearsed the exact phrasing in his trailer the night before, stripping out the slang, picking the leanest, sharpest words to try and force a bridge between the disaster he saw and the corporate metrics she demanded to hear. "Ma'am, the software is blind to it." He spoke with a low, dead calm intensity, stabbing his finger onto the red line. "The vein is right here. If we pour the main core pillar on this exact coordinate, the sheer weight is going to—" She snatched the notebook right out of his hands. Not with a violent, dramatic jerk. At first, it was just the casual, entitled swipe of someone confiscating an object that's in the wrong place to put it back where it belongs. But then Tommy looked into her eyes and saw the sheer venom pooling there, and he knew there wasn't a damn thing he could do to stop what was coming next. She spun around to face the crew gearing up nearby. There were maybe 15 guys standing there. Engineers, foremen, heavy operators, even the corporate PR photographer who had shown up to shoot the progress report. And with a sick, excruciating slowness that is infinitely more cruel than a quick explosion, because it forces the victim to swallow every single agonizing second of it. Ilara Vance started ripping the pages right out of the binding, one by one. Every single sheet she tore out held years of his life. It held the brutal 4 a.m. mornings. It held the blood and sweat of 3 different states, the intricate behavior of a dozen different soil types, the hard-earned mastery built over decades of actually paying attention to the physical world. The pages fluttered down into the freezing mud as the icy rain started up again, the graphite sketches instantly bleeding out into illegible, smeared garbage. This is a state-of-the-art construction site, not a damn museum for illiterate fantasies. Her voice was ice-cold and crystal clear, totally level, without a shred of screaming rage, which made it slice 100 times deeper than a tantrum. You are a severe liability to my project. Grab your trash and get out. Tommy just stood there, staring down at his life's work rotting in the mud, for a beat that felt like a lifetime. Then he slowly dropped to his knees, with his knees soaking through in the freezing mud, his bare hands digging into the icy slush. He started trying to save the pages, or whatever was left of them, because the dirty water was already dissolving the paper into mush. One of the Greenhorn junior engineers instinctively took a half-step toward him, reaching his hand out in that ancient human reflex to help a man who's been knocked down. Don't! Ilara Vance's voice cracked like a whip, freezing the kid dead in his tracks before the gesture even finished. Leave him. He needs to learn exactly where he belongs. The young engineer slowly pulled his hand back. He just stood there, his face burning with the suffocating shame of a coward who knows he's a coward, but doesn't have the spine to actually turn that shame into action. The rest of the crew stayed dead silent, that sickening, heavy silence of men witnessing a brutal injustice and actively choosing to play invisible to protect themselves, knowing damn well that the ghost of that choice is going to collect the bill later, when they're totally alone. The rain started coming down harder. Tommy scraped up whatever he could save. He clutched the soaking, ruined scraps of paper tightly against his chest, with hands that had literally helped build the skylines of major cities. And he slowly pushed himself back up to his feet. A single tear cut through the dirt on his weathered face, blending instantly into the freezing rain before it even hit his jaw, and it was impossible to tell where the heartbreak ended and the storm began. It is genuinely sickening to think someone could destroy decades of a man's life with her bare hands, in front of everyone, and then actually order the crew not to help the guy bleeding in the mud, isn't it? If your blood is boiling at this exact moment, if you recognize the pure injustice of what just went down, hit that like button right now. Show them you're riding with Tommy, because the pages Ilara Vance had just murdered in the mud weren't just paper. They were massive red flags. And red flags that get ignored don't just magically disappear. They wait in the dark. They wait with the terrifying patience of a subterranean river that doesn't care how many millions you spent building a wall over it. And the water vein was running significantly deeper than her shiny iPad had ever calculated. And they were about to dump the massive core foundation directly on top of it. Tommy walked off the site with the ruined pages crushed against his heart, and he never looked back once. There was a very specific, unbreakable dignity in his refusal to turn around. Not that cheap cinematic pride of a guy trying to look cool walking away from an explosion, but the ironclad internal dignity of a man who knows that looking back would give that toxic dirt pit and the people inside it an ounce of power they absolutely did not deserve. He walked straight to his rusted trailer, threw his meager life into a duffel bag that had never been heavy, because he knew better than to hoard garbage he didn't need, and he walked out. The machine kept grinding. With the psychopathic indifference of massive corporate projects, the site swallowed Tommy's absence the exact same way a truck engine accepts a new spark plug. No hesitation, no eulogy, no visible drop in momentum. The grunts kept swinging hammers. The concrete trucks kept rolling in. The elite board meetings kept happening, with Dr. Ilara Vance projecting her slick, updated timelines and efficiency metrics to a room full of billionaires who were practically drooling, watching their cash materialize exactly on schedule. She had made the call to hit the gas. The heat from the board was intense. There was a brutal delivery deadline attached to a massive, multi-million-dollar completion bonus, and Ilara had run the math, figuring out that by stacking the shifts and forcing a skeleton night crew, she could grab that check. The next major milestone was pouring the central core pillar, the absolute heart of the foundation, the massive anchor that the entire vertical weight of the skyscraper would ride on. Once that concrete was poured and cured, it was the absolute point of no return. The main core pour was locked in for 48 hours from now, directly on top of the exact kill zone Tommy had circled in red. Across town, in a cheap rundown motel room he had rented the same afternoon he got fired, Tommy was laying flat on his back, staring into the dark. He had tried to shut his brain off. His body was screaming for it. The brutal, bone-deep exhaustion of 30 years of hard labor had moved into his joints permanently, and normally, sleep hit him like a freight train the second his head touched the pillow. But tonight, the dark behind his eyelids was fully awake. It was projecting the trench. It was flashing that hairline fracture in the clay. It was replaying that creeping, muddy ribbon of water that was silently weeping out of the earth with the terrifying patience of a disaster waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He threw the covers off, flicked on the cheap flickering bedside lamp, and sat on the edge of the mattress for a long time, hands resting heavily on his knees, head bowed, like a man desperately trying to listen to a frequency nobody else could hear. The only thing he managed to salvage from the massacre was sitting on the scratched laminate nightstand. Not the diagrams. Most of those had melted into worthless gray sludge, and the surviving scraps were just torn, out of context geometry. The only thing sitting on the table was the photograph of his daughter. It had been wedged so deeply inside the thick leather binding that it survived the purge. He picked it up. He stared into her face for a long time, losing track of the minutes. She had that fierce, unstoppable grin he'd loved since she was a toddler. The smile of a girl who fought tooth and nail for every single victory and knew nobody had handed her a damn thing. He had been sitting in the folding chairs at that graduation, wearing the only cheap suit he owned, ironed perfectly with the exact same iron he used on his work shirts, and he'd snapped that picture on a cracked smartphone he couldn't afford to replace. She had no idea what had gone down in the mud this week. He hadn't called her, not out of toxic macho pride. It was way heavier than that. It was the deep, quiet reluctance of a father who had built his entire identity in his daughter's eyes, not on fat bank accounts or fancy titles, but on one unbreakable rule. You never ever abandon what you know is right, no matter how brutal the cost is. And that was the exact rule that was bleeding him out right now. Tommy gently set the photo back on the nightstand and stared blankly at the peeling wallpaper. And then, without even realizing when the switch had flipped, because the heaviest choices in life never announce themselves with a dramatic lightning strike, they just quietly solidify the second you stop fighting them. He thought about his old man. His dad had been a master mason in a dusty, blue-collar town, the kind of absolute workhorse who knew the name of every type of rock by how it cracked under pressure, not by some Latin textbook name. One of the old-school tricks he drilled into Tommy's head when he was barely 12 years old carrying buckets was a trick he called listening to the dirt. You fill a glass to the brim with water, set it flat on the earth, and watch the surface. If there was heavy kinetic energy moving underneath, a shifting water table, a pressurized gas pocket, a micro-fault settling, that water would catch the vibration long before any expensive shiny sensor ever woke up. It wasn't voodoo magic. It was raw physics, executed with whatever you had in your truck. Decades ago, on a job site just like this, his dad had set a glass down and told Tommy to watch. The surface of the water shivered violently, throwing off tiny erratic concentric rings. His dad had immediately ordered the massive pour to stop. The hotshot corporate engineer had thrown an absolute fit. 72 hours later, that exact grid of the site violently collapsed, opening up a massive subterranean sinkhole that wasn't on a single piece of official paperwork. Nobody ever shook his dad's hand. Nobody ever admitted the blue-collar guy just saved 20 lives. The suits just rerouted the blueprints, buried the mistake, and kept the machine moving. Tommy sat with that heavy ghost in the motel room for a long time. Then he checked the clock. It was 11:40 p.m. The main core pillar was getting poured at dawn. He sat dead still for a few more minutes, mentally weighing two massive forces that had absolutely no business being on the same scale. The ruthless, humiliating garbage they had done to him, versus the catastrophic nightmare that was about to drop on the heads of guys who had absolutely nothing to do with it. The grunts sleeping in the rusted trailers right now. The terrified rookie engineers who kept their mouths shut because they were trying to feed their kids. The innocent people who were going to live and work in that glass tower for the next 50 years. None of them were his problem. But he knew exactly what he knew, and he had learned over decades of bleeding for a living in environments where a bad call puts a guy in a body bag. That hoarding life-saving knowledge when you have the power to step up carries a massive, suffocating weight. It's not some philosophical debate. It's concrete. It's the kind of ghost that follows you to the grave. Tommy stood up, laced his steel-toed boots with the dead calm muscle memory of a guy gearing up for war, grabbed his battered tool bag, the one he carried out of pure survival instinct even when he didn't have a job, and walked out the door. The sight at midnight was an entirely different beast than it was in the blinding sun. The deafening roar of the heavy iron was dead, the skeleton night crew was pushing dirt on the outer perimeter, and the massive central foundation pit was sitting dead quiet, waiting for the sun and the concrete trucks. The blinding halogen security towers carved out violent islands of light against a sea of pitch black, making the crater look 10 times bigger and infinitely more dangerous. His beat-up keycard actually flashed green at the turnstile. He didn't know if it was an administrative glitch or if the suits were just too arrogant to actually disable it. Probably the latter, because corporate ghosts rarely consider a guy with a shovel enough of a threat to bother logging into the security mainframe. He walked right in. He moved straight toward the central pit, bypassing the illuminated paths, walking with the silent, predatory rhythm of a veteran who knew every inch of the mud by heart. When he hit the kill zone, he stopped dead, pressing his bare palm flat against the cold clay wall right next to the fracture. The water was still bleeding out, pushing slightly harder than before, not a gusher, but enough for a guy who spoke the language to know the earth was aggressively racking the slide on the shotgun. Tommy unzipped his bag. He didn't pack C4 or bolt cutters. He brought the weapons of a master builder: heavy coarse sand, perfectly graded fine gravel, and a highly specific bag of raw lime he had learned to mix from his old man. It was a chaotic old-school chemical mix he'd kept in his truck for 30 years because it packed tight and had literally stopped catastrophic structural failures on 4 different nightmare jobs. His dad just called it living mortar, not because it was magic, but because once it cured, it maintained a freakish flexibility that rigid modern concrete completely lacked. It could take a massive subterranean punch without shattering, acting like a bleeding edge shield that actively redirected the rogue water pressure instead of trying to stubbornly block it, effectively diffusing the exact hydraulic bomb that was about to level this site. He went to work. There was no panicked, frantic rushing, but his speed was terrifyingly precise, laying down every strata of material in the exact right sequence, cutting in the drainage bleeders with the dead reckoning of a guy who had the entire topographical slope memorized. He worked in absolute dead silence, guided only by the tight beam of his headlamp, making zero noise that would drag the skeleton crew over from the perimeter. He was an absolute ghost in the machine, a man who had been violently excommunicated from this exact dirt, slipping back into the dark not to settle a score, not to stroke his own ego, not to drop an "I told you so," but just doing the brutal, invisible work, because the work demanded to be done. By 3 a.m., the defensive barrier locking the fault line was solid. By 4 a.m., the heavy diversion trench was cut, surgically routing the lethal hydraulic pressure entirely away from the pillar's footprint. At 20 minutes to 5, he quietly packed his gear. The horizon was just starting to bleed that icy, dead gray pre-dawn light when he slipped back out the exact same way he came in. He left absolutely zero fingerprints behind, except the masterclass buried in the mud. He walked 2 miles to the bus stop and sat down to wait for the first route of the day. His hands coated in chemical lime, his knees soaked in clay, staring blankly at the halogen towers glowing in the distance. He had played his hand. The fallout wasn't his problem anymore. The morning of the core pour cracked open with a freezing, razor-sharp blue sky. The exact kind of cinematic high-def lighting that looks incredible on camera, which is exactly why Alara Vance had picked today for the massive investor livestream. The luxury corporate boardroom was locked and loaded. A massive secondary 4K monitor had been rigged up next to the main screen to run the live drone feed, right next to her flawless software telemetry. There was imported coffee and sparkling water on the mahogany table, and the webcam was perfectly angled, so the billionaires dialing in from 3 different time zones could see Alara dominating the foreground, with the massive construction site towering in the glass windows behind her. The ultimate power shot of an apex predator, completely running the world. She had slept like a rock. She woke up riding that massive, intoxicating high of absolute validation, not crossing her fingers and hoping for a win, but gearing up for a coronation. The site was running ahead of the aggressive new schedule. The core pour was the massive pivot point where the hole in the ground officially became a skyscraper, and the live stream was her victory lap in front of the guys holding the billion-dollar checkbooks. She had run a final diagnostic sweep at 7 a.m. flat. Every single telemetry bar was green, drainage grid running at 98.4%, geological stress parameters locked in the green zone. The million-dollar brain hadn't flagged a single threat. At 9:00 a.m. on the dot, the drone launched. Miles outside the city limits, sitting on a jagged limestone ridge that overlooked the massive valley and the job site, Tommy was sitting on a boulder with his elbows glued to his knees, his scarred hands locked together over his mouth. Sitting right next to him was his daughter. She had driven out late last night in the beat-up sedan she bought with her first real paycheck, after getting a cryptic 3-word text from her dad saying the contract was dead but he was okay. She knew damn well he wasn't okay. Kids raised by blue-collar ghosts who never complain learn how to read the silence. She had crashed on the floor of his cheap motel, cooked whatever garbage was left in the kitchenette, and this morning she just asked him where to drive. He gave her the coordinates without a single word of explanation, and she didn't push it, because she knew her old man sometimes had to stare a demon right in the face before he could finally talk about it. Now they were both just sitting there on the rocks, staring down at the massive crater. She had no idea what they were waiting for. He knew exactly what he was waiting for, but he had no idea if he was about to watch a miracle or a massacre. They could see the drone from the ridge, a tiny black speck hovering over the massive central pit with the terrifying stability of military-grade tech. The heavy concrete pump trucks were locked into position. The crew was holding the line, and then, with the ruthless punctuality of a project running on corporate adrenaline, the gray mud started flowing. Up in the ivory tower, Ilara was leaning hard over the mahogany table, eyes bouncing violently between the crystal-clear drone feed and her glowing data readouts. The billionaires on the monitors were actively cheering her on, a few of them already loudly crunching the numbers for the massive completion bonus. The room was practically vibrating with that elite predatory electricity that hits right before a massive gamble officially pays out, the sick rush of arrogant people watching the universe bend to their will. 1 million pounds of wet concrete slammed down into the forms. And then came the noise. It wasn't a sharp explosion, it was infinitely worse. A deep, guttural, earth-shattering groan that vibrated up through the soles of their boots before it ever hit their eardrums. It was the terrifying sound of the earth taking a massive, violent breath. On the 4K drone feed, the solid ground surrounding the massive central pillar started to liquefy. It wasn't an instant, catastrophic crater. Not yet. It was a sickening, agonizing sink. The earth collapsing millimeter by millimeter, caught on ultra-high-definition cameras for the billionaires to watch in real time. The massive concrete form started to violently tilt, slowly but undeniably, like a full glass of water sliding off a broken table. Ilara's iPad started screaming. 1 alarm, then 3 overlapping sirens. Then the entire telemetry board violently flipped from pristine green to radioactive red, with the terrifying brutality of a total system failure. The kind of red that isn't asking a question, it's screaming that you're already dead. Massive block letters flashed across the screens. Unforeseen subsurface void detected. Critical geological anomaly. Catastrophic structural risk. The million-dollar brain had finally found the rogue water vein. Exactly 48 hours too late. Ilara froze like she'd been shot in the chest, eyes locked on the flashing red screens, her brain violently short-circuiting as it tried to process the massive, lethal gap between her godlike arrogance and the total disaster unfolding on live TV in front of her investors. On the video monitors, the billionaires' faces completely melted. A chaotic screaming match erupted, voices spiking, panic taking over. The absolute bloodbath that happens when ruthless men watch $50 million start sinking into the mud. She didn't answer them. She physically couldn't. She just stood there paralyzed, palms glued to the desk, staring at the drone feed, waiting for the massive concrete tower to snap and kill everyone in the pit. Up on the ridge, Tommy had launched off the rock. His daughter was right beside him, gripping his jacket, totally blind to the engineering but instantly recognizing the terror. Tommy was staring down the valley with his eyes blown wide, holding his breath so hard his chest burned, the knuckles on his clenched fists turning bone white. And then, the massive pillar stopped sinking. A brutal shockwave ripped through it, visible even from the ridge, a violent shudder traveling straight up the steel and concrete spine. The liquid earth around the base violently contracted, like a massive muscle flexing hard to catch a falling weight. And then, with a terrifying, agonizing slowness, the pillar locked into place. It was tilted a few microscopic degrees off true north, but it caught. It held. Nothing moved down in the pit. It was the suffocating, deafening silence of 100 men who had fully accepted they were about to die, trying to process the fact that they were still breathing. The grunts stared at each other. The engineers stared at the leaning tower. The site foreman slowly crept toward the edge of the crater with the terrified hesitation of a guy walking up to an unexploded bomb. And when he finally got close enough to look down into the deep cut, he froze dead in his tracks. There was something buried down there that wasn't on any shiny corporate blueprint. A highly intricate hand-cut network of diversion trenches packed with coarse sand and grated gravel, webbing around the catastrophic failure point in a pattern that was pure, aggressive genius. Every single angle was mathematically cut to match the natural topographical slope, violently ripping the rogue water pressure away from the pillar's base. And locking every single joint, absorbing the lethal kinetic pressure, was a thick, pale mortar that was still damp to the touch, like a ghost had come in the middle of the night and literally glued the earth back together. The foreman screamed for the chief engineer. The chief engineer stared down into the pit for 3 solid minutes without blinking. He was a guy with a fancy diploma who had actually taken his lumps in the real world, and he had learned the hard way that a textbook doesn't know a damn thing about how the earth actually fights back. He recognized the raw lime. He recognized the brutal genius of the pressure bleeders. It wasn't something they taught at MIT. It was older than MIT. It was an ancient, blue-collar survival tactic that had kept buildings standing for 100 years because it actually worked. He ripped his radio off his vest with a shaking hand and dialed straight into the boardroom. Alara snatched it on the first ring. The engineer's voice cut through the speaker with a terrifying clarity. It wasn't panicked screaming. It was that dead calm, lethal tone of a guy who realizes exactly how close he just came to a body bag, choosing his words like razor blades because the truth is too massive to screw up. Alara. A heavy beat. Someone was down here in the dark. The drainage. The foundation lock. It's not on the grid. It's nowhere in your code. Another brutal pause. It's an old-school bleed system. Sand, heavy gravel, raw lime, dug out by hand last night. His voice dropped into a low growl. It was him, the guy you fired in the mud. The silence that nuked the boardroom was a completely different species of quiet than anything else in this story. It was the dead air silence of a billion-dollar ego violently collapsing in on itself. Not a loud, dramatic explosion, just the sickening, inevitable implosion of a glass tower built on a foundation of absolute garbage. Alara stood paralyzed with the phone glued to her ear, staring out the floor-to-ceiling glass at the dirt pit below. Staring at the massive concrete tower that was only standing because it had been saved in the dark by the exact same scarred hands she had arrogantly tossed in the trash. Up on the ridge, Tommy slowly unclenched his fists. The massive crushing tension bled out of his spine with the agonizing slowness of a man dropping a 100-pound weight he'd been carrying for a month. He just stared down at the site for another minute, not throwing a fist in the air, not grinning like a maniac, but wearing the dead calm peace of a guy who saw the devil, did his job, and can finally walk away. His daughter squeezed his shoulder. She whispered his name, turning it into a question. He turned to look at her, and for the first time in a long, dark week, the smile that cracked his weathered face was completely, undeniably real. Not the arrogant smirk of a guy who just won a fight, but the rarest, heaviest smile on earth. The smile of a man who held the line, did the right thing, and lived to see it hold. That catastrophic video wasn't shot by some rogue whistleblower. It was the exact 4K drone feed Alara had proudly rigged up for the VIPs. Her arrogant victory lap, instantly mutating into a brutal, high-def documentary of her own execution. One of the billionaires had hit screen record on the Zoom call. Some junior analyst edited it down to 2 minutes. And what detonated across every elite engineering and heavy construction group chat on the planet a few hours later was exactly that. 37 seconds of the Earth swallowing a $50 million pillar, and in the corner of the screen, the $1 million software screaming "Unforeseen subsurface void detected" in flashing red lights. Unforeseen subsurface void detected. In the cutthroat world of elite mega construction, where your reputation is your only currency, and it can be vaporized by a single push notification, that video was a nuclear bomb. The blast radius expanded instantly. The ruthless questions started flying. And those questions triggered a massive, highly aggressive formal tribunal that the billionaires demanded with a unified, bloodthirsty rage that left zero room for corporate spin. The independent forensic report took 5 grueling days. 5 days of outside auditors ruthlessly tearing apart every single line of code, every email, every single red flag that got buried. They proved the software had been fed garbage data. The national database had pulled its core samples during a severe summer drought when the water table was completely dead. and the million-dollar algorithm had blindly built a 50-year projection without factoring in a single drop of seasonal variance. It was a catastrophic, undeniable tech failure. Hard data, but what turned the report from a standard software glitch into a corporate execution was the final chapter. The auditors had pulled the receipts, the foreman's taped interview, the junior engineer who confessed to watching Tommy get humiliated in the mud, the site safety logs. It was ironclad proof that a blue-collar grunt had manually identified the killer anomaly weeks before the pour. There was a brutal paper trail proving he had tried to flag the crisis twice. And there was eyewitness testimony that Dr. Vance had publicly mocked him, ripped up his data, and fired him on the spot the third time he tried to save her life. The board of directors pulled the trigger on a Wednesday afternoon. Ilara Vance was sitting in the hot seat when the verdict dropped. She had geared up for war, spending days crafting a slick, aggressive defense that pinned the blame on the software vendor, the flawed national database, and freak weather patterns. It was a brilliant, bulletproof corporate defense. It's exactly the kind of spin that saves your job when the problem is just bad code. But the problem wasn't bad code. The board didn't fire her for the software glitch. They publicly terminated her for gross, catastrophic negligence and for running a toxic dictatorship that actively suffocated vital, life-saving intel. The difference was lethal. It wasn't just a math error. It was the arrogant, psychotic choice to silence the guy who knew the truth, risking dozens of lives and $50 million just to protect her own ego. She was escorted out of the building without her keycard, her elite reputation completely vaporized, permanently branded as a liability. That exact same afternoon, a luxury SUV that hadn't seen the bad side of town in a decade pulled up to a rusty chain-link fence outside a rundown motel. Ilara Vance stepped out onto the cracked asphalt, carrying herself with that rigid, unnatural stiffness of someone who is used to summoning people, not hunting them down. She hesitated on the sidewalk for a long, painful beat before pushing the squeaky gate open. Tommy was sitting on the concrete porch with his daughter. There were 2 cheap coffee mugs between them, and their quiet conversation instantly died the second the SUV pulled up. His daughter took one look at the woman in the designer coat, looked at her dad, and Tommy just gave a microscopic nod. The silent father-daughter code for letting him handle this. Ilara walked up the concrete steps and stood right in front of him. Tommy stayed seated for a long moment before slowly pushing himself up, not out of respect for her title, but because he was a man about to deliver a verdict, and you stand up for that. She started talking. It was highly rehearsed, the slick corporate bullet points bleeding through her panic, starting with a heavily sanitized apology, quickly pivoting to an offer to reinstate his contract, immediately tossing out a senior consultant title and a fat hazard pay bonus to buy his silence. It was the ultimate corporate desperation play. It was her trying to buy her way out of a bloodbath by treating a man's dignity like a line item on a spreadsheet. Tommy let her run her mouth until she ran out of gas. When she finally shut up, he just stared at her in dead silence. Then he slowly reached into his faded flannel shirt pocket and pulled out the only thing he had left, the battered leather notebook cover. The pages were gone, washed away in the mud. It was just the shell, warped by the rain and stained with dry clay, totally ruined but still holding its shape. He looked down at it for a second. Then he looked Ilara dead in the eye. "You didn't see the water." His voice was dead calm, completely stripped of any screaming rage, dropping the words with the lethal precision of a sniper. "You just saw a piece of trash you thought you could step on." She didn't say a single word. Something broke in her face right then. It wasn't the arrogant smirk from the trailer. It wasn't the blind panic from the boardroom. It wasn't the slick corporate mask she wore to the motel. It was something infinitely heavier and harder to swallow. It was the crushing, absolute realization of a woman who finally understands that she broke something a fat check could never, ever buy back. Tommy turned to his daughter, who had stepped back out onto the porch, and introduced her with the quiet, undeniable pride of a man showing off the real legacy he built with his bare hands. She was halfway through her PhD in geotechnical engineering at a massive Ivy League heavyweight, the exact same university that Ilara used to consider her own personal kingdom. "She runs the shiny software," Tommy said, and the smile that cracked his face was the heaviest, most beautiful thing in this entire story, because it was loaded with fierce pride, a little bit of heartbreak, and a massive dose of pure, hard-earned peace. But I taught her how to listen to the dirt first. The fallout over the next few months wasn't some fast, cinematic explosion. It was the brutal, grinding reality of true justice, slow, methodical, and totally irreversible. The million-dollar software suite was ripped off the market after the forensic report became a mandatory case study in 2 major engineering journals. Ilara's pending contracts evaporated into thin air. Her 15-year elite reputation wasn't blown up overnight. It was slowly, toxically corroded into a joke, which is a hell of a lot worse. She eventually surfaced teaching online seminars on corporate engineering ethics, being forced to use her own catastrophic arrogance as the prime example. Nobody knows if she did it to repent or just to pay the rent, but she was stuck wearing the badge. The corporate brass aggressively carved out a brand new title just for Tommy, Senior Geotechnical Overseer, handing him the absolute ironclad authority to walk onto any site, in any phase, and pull the emergency brake if his gut told him the computers were blind. It wasn't the fanciest title on the corporate ladder, but on the dirt he was God. In the official PR photo taken the day they cut the ribbon on the finished tower, Tommy was standing right on top of the main core pillar wearing a pristine, bright white hard hat, his massive scarred hands resting flat against the concrete, looking down at the beast he had tamed in the dark. Tucked securely into his high-vis vest was a brand new leather notebook, a gift from his daughter, the first few pages already packed with aggressive hand-drawn schematics for the next war zone. But the real image, the one that never made the corporate brochures but became a legendary ghost story in the industry, happened on a random Tuesday afternoon out in a dirt lot behind the main office. A crew of hotshot junior engineers was sitting in the mud around an old blue-collar veteran. Sitting right next to him was a PhD student who occasionally jumped in to translate his old-school slang into textbook physics when he lost the word, and he just let her run with it, smiling with the dead calm peace of a man whose ego wasn't so fragile that he needed to be the smartest guy in the room. Tommy had set a glass filled to the absolute brim with water, flat on the dirt. He told the kids to stare at the surface. "The screen gives you the math," he growled with the heavy patience of a man who has all the time in the world. "But the dirt has a voice. You better learn how to listen to both." The water in the glass was dead still, and then, for a split second, it shivered. "Now I'm asking you, if you were in Tommy's steel-toe boots after all the garbage they put you through, after the ripped-up life's work, the public execution, bleeding in the mud while they laughed at you, would you have walked back into the dark to save the monster who destroyed you? Or would you have walked away and let the water drown them all? Drop your verdict in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you would do if it was you holding the shovel. Because this story proves that true, undeniable brilliance isn't about having $1 million answer key. It's about having the spine to respect the truth, no matter what package it comes in. The survival instincts burned into the scarred hands of a man who has listened to the dirt for 30 years are just as lethal as $1 million algorithm. And the fastest way to put yourself in a body bag, in your career or in your life, isn't a math error. It's the blinding arrogance that stops you from listening to the guy trying to save your life. If you believe that real grit deserves absolute respect, and if you love stories that hit hard and make you think, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell to join the crew. The next story is already locked and loaded.